Well, good morning and welcome to our last weather briefing here for the virtual breakfast series this season. You're going to see here some themes. One of them is change. We've probably all experienced here just over the last 12 to 24 hours, but there are more changes coming. And I think as we look ahead, our outlook, there's some consistency in it and pointing in a warmer and drier than normal still type of direction, which I think again is for many agricultural activities is probably a positive thing. But I'll talk more about that in just a second. So I'd like to start off though, looking here at first of all the last week and where we've been. On the left-hand side here, you can see it was another warmer than normal week, significantly warmer in some spots, 3 to as much as 6 degrees Fahrenheit above normal across the state. And that was true over almost all of the upper Midwest as well. At the same time, depending on location, it was certainly for northern and eastern lower Michigan and portions of southern upper Michigan, another drier than normal week. And it was a drier than normal week across the south until the beginning of this week when we had a frontal system go through, actually a couple frontal systems go through here with half to 1 inch or greater totals here, most of that which fell on Monday. At my house in Hazlet, I measured 1.87, which was the heaviest rain we'd seen here in actually some time, a couple of years at this particular location. But it was as a result of several different showers and thunderstorms that fell, again, mostly Monday evening and into the overnight hours then. And it changed things, but it had been drier than normal up until that point. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. Looking at since this is our last briefing here, I did want to say something about the growing season itself, and that is it was a warmer than normal growing season for much of the state. That's on the left-hand side here. This is the June, July, and August, so the summer season here collectively characterized, and 1 or 2 degrees Fahrenheit above normal. So it wasn't a large departure, but it was warmer than normal over most areas. There are a couple of exceptions to that, but most of the state and region did end up warmer than normal. And we did have a little bit of a surplus in degree days. You'll see that here in just a moment. I think the bigger story probably certainly is the precipitation. And as we look on the right-hand side here, you can see a pattern which I think is characteristic of not just the summer, but much of the growing season itself, in that we had surpluses of precipitation in west central and some southern areas of lower Michigan, also portions of western portions of upper Michigan as well, where the greens here, you can see an inch or so, a couple of inches, and even better than that in the far south, a departure from normal for the growing season. But in contrast, and really importantly, we did have areas of northern and especially eastern lower Michigan here into the southeastern portion of the lower peninsula, where our precipitation has lagged behind normal for much of the growing season. And there we do have some areas with departures of several inches from normal. And again, and depending on location, depending on soil type, that has been a continuing problem. We currently have about 32 or 33% of the state classified as abnormally dry in terms of from the U.S. Drought Monitor here. And much of that does reflect the area you're seeing here from northern lower into east central lower Michigan. That's where we still have, at least relative to normal, that's where we have the driest portion of the state. I mentioned degree days, and on the left-hand side here, this is a seasonal total going back to the beginning of May, and it reflects, again, thinking here primarily about corn and thermal time and accumulations of degree days, and the pattern that we've had all year, and that is surplus of growing degree days across southern portions of the state. You can see that here on the map, pretty evident, and then some minor deficits as you go way up north into upper Michigan, and you can see there's also other areas of the region that do have some deficits. But that pattern has it developed early in the growing season. We've had that throughout, and they're not large departures one way or the other. In the south, you could argue maybe that at least in terms of degree days, we probably have a good calendar week surplus or ahead of normal. And on the right-hand side here, this is something you may have seen a graphic from the U2U project here looking at growing degree day accumulation. This is an application for hypothetical corn planted on the 10th of May, and I just use an example here for Ingham County, locally here in East Lansing. So it's a 103 day relative maturity hybrid planted on May 10th in Ingham County. And the key is here, you look at the green are conditions this particular year. It's an accumulation of degree days. And what this application is used for is basically to tell us something about how likely we are to reach physiological maturity or when in the fall season, and relative to typically what we would see the first killing freeze. And in this case, I'm using 28 degrees Fahrenheit as a killing freeze. So there's a lot on here, but just let me talk about this really, really quickly. The green line, again, is what actually was observed. The purple line is the long-term climatological normal. And what you can see from this first off is that we have had a consistent surplus, like the map on the left-hand side does suggest. It also suggests that as we move in here closer into the future, and this green line here, this is black layer of physiological maturity. You can see that right now, at least with this simulation for that hybrid, or 103 day and a little bit longer maturity rating here locally for that type of a hybrid, that we are right now should be reaching black layer or physiological maturity. I have a research project with Manny Singh here locally, and our observations would match this pretty closely. And just as importantly, as we look at the future here, all these blue lines here, these are killing first 28 degree temperatures of the fall, the distribution of those, and when they occur. And you can see typically climatologically, the risk of this starts in the last week or 10 days of September through the month of October. The most common time for this to occur is mid-October, and then we go all the way into some cases, some years, we don't see the first 28 until the month of November. But the big issue is here, as we look at this curve here, the dashed line is what's projected with climatology. Looking ahead, that for this particular example, not only is the crop at or going to reach maturity, it's going to do that before we see a killing freeze. So the chances of getting hit this year, for most people, I would think would be relatively low. I think this is a favorable outcome, or certainly good news, and it suggests again that we won't have problems, other than in situations where the crop, the planting was abnormally late for some reason, or it was a long season cultivar. But it's with the warm weather this season that shows up here. So that's a favorable outcome, at least suggest that we won't have much problem with this year. I mentioned the research project we have here locally. I would also note that given the very warm, dry week that we had over the last week to 10 days, we're observing corn dry down. Actually, one of our observations we're taking on a daily basis in the same field in the same place. And we've had very, very favorable conditions for dry down. And that the corn particular plots that I'm looking at decreased from 40% moisture on the 3rd of September down to a mean of 24% on the 10th. At almost 2%, a little bit more than 2% per day was what it averaged. And that's about top end, I think, very, very high for Michigan. So very, very favorable conditions. And I know some of you already, of course, started with this, with harvest, or just really beginning in earnest now, but things with that warm, dry weather, it really helped move things along here out in the real world. Well, looking at our forecast here, I did mention changes, and of course we can feel those now. It's significantly cooler, and we are looking at actually a very active weather pattern, and it's characterized by high amplitude jet stream flow across North America. So both big ridges and big troughs are likely to impact us, which means some fairly large swings of weather here at least over the next week. On the weather map this morning, big area of high pressure here in the northern Great Plains, and that air mass is right out of Canada, and that is the reason why it feels so much cooler. This is the coolest air mass that we've seen move into the upper Midwest here so far this season. And again, there's a lot of evidence out there with temperatures in some cases the upper 40s. We're not going to see today high temperatures make it much more than the 50s, maybe a couple 60-degree readings in the far south. We also, given the temperature of this air mass, and given that the Great Lakes are still well into the upper 60s and even some low 70s, we will see some lake effect rain showers in areas. So there is a chance, especially in those lake effect areas, northern and western, northern and western lower, and then northern upper Michigan, we could see some scattered showers. Very little in terms of amounts, but there will be clouds. It will also be very breezy. You can see a lot of black lines or isobars packed here, indicating a fairly steep pressure gradient. So a much cooler, breezy, and an early, definitely a fall type of feel to things here today as the day goes on. Down in the lower right-hand side here, you can see some curved isobars. That is Hurricane Fiona. Still a Category 4 as of Thursday morning, and it's headed northward. It looks like it's going to move just to the west of Bermuda and give them some high surf, but fortunately not a direct hit. But as you will see here in the forecast, we're not done with Fiona yet. It looks like it's going to make a landfall somewhere in the Canadian Maritimes here in a couple days. Here's the forecast for tomorrow morning, and you can see the center of the high pressure is moved to looks like Berrien County here in the southwestern corner of the state, and that means that we're going to see a fairly chilly overnight here tonight. And mention that here just in a moment, but it does set the stage for clearing and calm conditions, and probably for at least some parts of the state in the north, it will be the first freeze of the season here. Next weather system, though, just to the west of that, you can see off into the northern plains. That gets here on Saturday, but I'll talk more about that in a second. But first, looking at overnight temperatures here, we are looking at, as I mentioned, with that high pressure, some sub-freezing temperatures, primarily across western and central portions in the interior upper peninsula. It'll be a little warmer than that right on the shorelines. Across much of lower Michigan, generally the mid to upper 30s probably is what we're dealing with. So what that means, probably no freezing temperatures, but we may see some frost formation, especially in low-lying areas where cold air ponds. And again, it would be, for most areas, it will be the first such event here we've had this season. But I think that the big message is that for much of the, at least for the lower peninsula, we're still going to be looking at more growing season. We won't see, it certainly won't be freezing, or that's not likely right now, at least from the what we're seeing. But mid to upper 30s still could lead to some scattered frost in some low-lying areas. So don't be surprised if you see that. Tomorrow will likely be the coldest day with this particular weather system, this high pressure system. It moves through. It'll be warmer by Saturday morning. And here's the map for Saturday morning. You can see the next weather system approaching the state from the west. It is not a big rain producer. Greatest totals and the greatest threat of rain will be across the north, across upper Michigan and into the northern lower. That will begin mostly later in the day on Saturday. And then we're looking at a trough, another troughing feature moving into the region here over the weekend and into next week. That'll mean a continuing chance, almost on a daily basis, late Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and maybe even Tuesday, where we will see the threat of showers. Right now, it looks as though the greatest threat for rainfall with this pattern will probably be on Sunday and possibly into Monday. Not looking or expecting heavy rains, primarily a tenth to a quarter of an inch where rainfall does occur, but there will be, and it will be still cool with temperatures generally from the 50s north to the 60s south. A little bit warmer here this weekend, but then cooling down once again into the 50s for the early part of next week. So a very, very fall-like pattern. One last thing you can see here off to our north and east, you can see Hurricane Fiona moving into the Canadian Maritimes, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland, that part of the world. So again, Fiona is going to probably have more impact before it becomes extratropical, or it's in the process of becoming extratropical at this time, but still more to deal with that particular storm. Now, for precipitation totals, given what we've just talked about for the weekend, we are looking for generally another drier than normal week here coming up, with less than a quarter of an inch over most areas, especially across central and southern lower Michigan. A little bit higher, you can see the blue shading here near the lakes. That's the attempt of the forecasters to add a little bit of lake effect. Some of that would be here today. Also, maybe a little bit early next week, but mostly, again, light precipitation totals. The highest totals likely to be across upper Michigan and the far northwestern lower here over the next week. But for most people, it will be drier than normal. And again, that should help at least continue or at least reduce the threat of delays in terms of field work in the next day. One last thing about this is we look at the pattern into next week. I mentioned a highly amplified pattern with lots of big ridges and troughs. And most of this upcoming week, we will be seeing troughing across the region. But by late next week, ridge moves back into the area. And there's also now a lot of consistency. The outlooks are also calling for the formation of another tropical disturbance in the Caribbean, possibly moving into the Gulf by late next week and possibly impacting the U.S. That's something to keep an eye on. But certainly, it does suggest a warming trend by the middle to latter part of next week back to above normal levels. And given that, looking here now at the medium range, you can see that in the outlooks. And I'm going to show you both the 6 to 10 and 8 to 14 day timeframes. In the 6 to 10 day outlook, which is the last few days of September, you can see some of what I was just talking about, troughing over the Great Lakes and over the eastern part of the U.S., ridging over the west, and with the mean temperature forecast here on the right, you can see that Michigan's still in that normal to below normal. That's certainly what we're looking at through the middle of next week. Also note down below, just as importantly, very, very high probability of drier than normal. And that's also consistent in our outlooks. But by the time we move into the first few days of October, you can see some movement. And so these patterns are actually progressive. They're moving from west to east across the U.S. and a flattening out of the jet stream flow here across North America, leading to certainly a moderation or an increase in mean temperatures. And I think that's a good bet for looking again as the month ends and October begins. We should probably be seeing a warming trend. At the same time, though, a continuation of drier than normal conditions is expected. So thinking again about harvest and field work, this is going to probably permit things to continue on. Even though we may have showers at times, the fact that the amounts are going to be below normal should help in terms of keeping things moving. Now, the new long lead outlooks for the remainder of the fall and into the early winter. On the top here, we've got October mean temperatures. And on the upper right is precipitation totals for October. They're similar to what we saw before last month, but definitely still calling for warmer than normal conditions here during October. That is also true for the 3-month outlook, October through December. You can see that down below in the lower left. And almost the same forecast for precipitation, the equal chance or no forecast direction. The forecasters just didn't have much to hang their hat on, but if anything, certainly looking here at the next few weeks, one would, I think, still conclude warmer and maybe even a little bit drier than normal, especially given that medium range forecast guidance. So thinking again about harvest and so forth, that is a positive thing, I think, to allow things to move faster than they typically do. And then finally, looking at our outlook for the winter, the big news here is that La Nina conditions continue down in the equatorial Pacific. That's what this time lapse is down here below. The blue areas here are all cooler than normal sea surface temperatures in the central and eastern equatorial Pacific. That's the sort of the signature of a La Nina event. And with that, our mid to late winter, especially outlook, this is December through February, the 3-month period here. You can see normal to below normal mean temperatures, especially as you go west from Michigan. But the bigger, I think, signal here, and more important one, is that it does also, in La Nina years, we typically see above normal precipitation. And given the temperatures, that means probably above normal snowfall. Not always, and this is true with all of these. This is, by the way, this is the 3rd consecutive La Nina winter that we've had globally. That in itself is unusual because these events typically happen on average climatologically once every 2 to 7 years. That's for one of these winters. So the fact that we've had 3 is unusual. It's only happened twice since 1950. The other part of that is that the stronger these events, and that typically reflects things like how cool or how warm are these anomalies here. This is not a strong event. It's a moderate intensity La Nina. And that typically is correlated with how likely we are to see these impacts. So we had a La Nina last winter, and we did not see the weather and climate impacts that we typically do. So just a reminder, this is the best that we probably have in terms of a forecast tool, but still, it's not it's not foolproof, and the statistics don't always tell the whole story. So, but for what it's worth now, it's still that wintry type of scenario that one would expect during a La Nina winter. Finally, the last thing here down on the bottom, these are monthly probabilities or seasonal probabilities of what's happening in the Pacific. The blue bars here are the likelihood of La Nina conditions in a given season. And what this basically says is that La Nina is likely to continue or persist through the upcoming winter before dissipating next spring. And the gray line there, that's the neutral scenario. That's what's in between what we don't have if we don't have either La Nina or El Nino, which is the warm cycle or the warm phase of the El Nino Southern Oscillation. The grays in between. And so what all these outlooks suggest is that, yes, La Nina continues for the next few months, but we go back to neutral by the middle of next year. And that's what these outlooks reflect. And so with that, I will wrap up. Again, we've seen some pretty significant changes here just recently. We'll see more of that over the next couple of days with an unsettled and cool fall-like type of pattern. Maybe some freezing temperatures in northern parts of the state the first of the season, but for most of the state, we'll continue. This is not a killing freeze. Very unlikely to see killing freeze conditions in the southern part of the state, so the season will continue there. And then, as we just saw with the medium and longer term guidance, we are after some cool fall-like weather, likely to see a return of warmer and probably drier, a little drier than normal conditions here late in September and into early October. And that should help things along here with wrapping up the season. So with that, I thank you for your attention here during the season and wish you good luck with harvest and in the off season. Thank you.